Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. An original adaptation written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Part 2. The Bishop's Tale. The great hall of Camelot fell quiet. What had only a few moments ago been a busy, bustling air alive with voices became calm and expectant, as all eyes turned towards a still, small voice. From his place beside Arthur, the Bishop Gawain stood. He was not a tall man, so standing hardly made much difference, but there was a sturdiness to him that spoke of a life not always lived in a cassock.
"I believe I have a tale to tell," he repeated. "One that is particularly fitting for this time of year, though I did not mean to still the air so soundly."
"Ha!" barked Arthur. "Here are my knights, warriors all, who have faced peril and cold and darkness, and yet here they are, cowed by the very sight of you, Bishop." The knights laughed, Gawain among them, and Arthur clapped the old figure on the shoulder warmly. "You are, as always, most welcome here, father, and my contest was not extended solely to knights and ladies. Tell us your tale." Arthur sat, and all eyes returned to Gawain, who took a deep breath and began.
"I heard this story," said the old man, "from a monk I met on the holy isle of Lindisfarne. He had been working to establish a monastery among the Nordic tribes in the lands of the north. I know him to be a stout man of good character, and so I can only conclude that this tale is true and happened exactly as I will recount it to you now."
The room was already silent, but somehow it grew silenter still, and Gawain was sure the whole crowd leaned forward and took a collective breath as the bishop commenced his story.
"On the island of Iceland there lived a farmer named Thorhall. He had rich holdings with a great deal of land to grow crops and raise cattle. He had a beautiful wife who he loved with all his heart, and he was well liked and respected in the town, and yet Thorhall was greatly distressed, because his land was cursed with a constant current of wights and spirits haunting his farmstead. Who knows why this had happened? Some say such visitations are a result of the actions of the resident. Some say they are brought to the land by foul deeds in the past. Still others will claim some areas of this world are just plain dark, as though the boundaries against the gates of hell are thinner there than in other places. Whatever the case, Thorhall's land was haunted by spirits who would torment his family and his workers. Over the years he had hired shepherds and drovers to tend his livestock on the land, but none had lasted more than a few months, let alone a full season. Each had left with the same report of dark voices on the land, whispering terrors and secrets, inciting the men to terrible deeds. Some had been attacked, others had been shocked into submission. Thorhall was no longer a young man, and so in urgency he renewed his search for a herdsman to take over from him. But now his search turned from experienced landsmen to those who were hardy and doughty. But even among such folks, soldiers, warriors, and the like, he could find no man who would be willing to brave the haunted task. Finally, he heard of a man who knew no fear, and he set out to meet him at a nearby inn. The farmer sat by the fire, and soon a tall man strode in. He was broad and powerfully made, but surly and scowling, with dark eyes that seemed to drink in light. When he spoke, it was with a rasping whisper, as if the warmth had been leached from his voice many years past. "Sir, you're the farmer in need of help?" the man asked. "I am," replied Thorhall. "I hear you're a man who's not afraid of ghosts and spirits." "Glama is my name," said the man, "and I do not fear such superstitions." "I assure you, sir, they are no superstitions," replied Thorhall, eager that Glama should be fully aware of what he was entering into. "I have experienced this myself, and I have lost many good workers to the terrors of the land. There is a darkness there I cannot fully put into words." Glama spat into the fire, a sneer on his lips. "Like I said," he replied, Superstitions. Thorhild tried again. But I must impress upon you. Do you want my help? Interrupted Glamour. Or not? I do, Thorhild confessed. Lord help me, but I do. Lord, sneered Glamour, spitting again. Your superstitions know no bounds, it seems. Very well. Let us discuss terms. Well, began Thorhild, my usual rate for herdsmen is... I believe you told me, Glamour interjected, that you have not been able to hold on to a herdsman for some time. Indeed, if you wanted a herdsman worth a usual rate, you would not be here with me, and yet here we are. I believe I shall set the rate. And so he did. It was a much higher rate than Thorhild would usually pay, and in truth it was far higher than he could afford. But he was in a desperate situation, so a bargain was struck. For some months, Glamour lived with Thorhild and his wife and tended to their herds, and though he was not what you might call a pleasant man, it did appear he was not afraid of the whites, and he would spend days and nights out amongst them. But though Glamour may not have believed in the spirits of the land, it would seem they believed in him, and they were not idle as he dwelt amongst them. The longer he spent in the dark places, especially at night, the darker his mood became. As winter drew in and the nights grew longer, Glamour's already surly spirit became inky black, and the few remaining flecks of joy in his dark eyes winked out. At Christmas Eve, he woke, dressed, and called upon the farmer's wife for meat.
But it is Christmas Eve, Glamour, the woman replied. Today is a fasting day before the feast of tomorrow. No God-fearing man would eat meat today.
And what gives you the impression that I am a God-fearing man? Rasped Glamour. I do not fear. I take. The farmer's wife took a step back in shock as Glamour went on. He loomed over her, those dark, lightless eyes boring into her. It seems to me that this God of you Christians has brought no more joy to it than the heathen times of old, and so I shall not hold to his ways. Bring me meat. So Glamour ate and strode out to tend the herds. That night, while all the rest of the town was at the Yuletide Mass, Glamour sat out amongst the spirits tending to Thorhild's herds. But the next day, he did not return. All day long the townsfolk sought for him, but no sign could be found until eventually they came across a monstrous sight. Glamour's body, its skin blue-grey with frost. Now they knew he would need a proper burial in the consecrated grounds of the church so his spirit could lie at rest, but no matter how hard they tried and how many strong men lifted, the body could not be moved. It was like some force was holding it down. With the night drawing in, they did what they could to set Glamour's body at rest, built a cairn around it, and led the sheep back home. It was then that the hauntings began. But this was not like before, where the whites had been away on the farmland. Now it was amongst them. It started small, with creaks and bangs and shrieks among the town, but then it grew. Milk would begin to curdle, meat would spoil, grain would rot. Soon people would be attacked by an unseen force as they walked around the town, and all the while a deep, rasping laughter could be heard. Glamour's laughter. It would seem that Glamour's body, not laid to rest, had produced a spirit that would know no rest either. But this was not just an unquiet spirit. This was the spirit of a man who knew no fear, and that produces a ghostly apparition that knows no fear either. The locals of that land call such a spirit a draugar, a revenant. It held the town in a grip of fear, sometimes attacking invisibly, sometimes appearing as a towering grey figure, with those dark eyes the townsfolk remembered so well. For weeks, then months, then years, the tormenting spirit of Glamour walked among the town. Several times the townsfolk called in brave men and warriors to fight the revenant spirit, but always their bodies would be found beaten and broken upon the cairn that marked Glamour's burial place. Eventually, the fame of the town and its resident Draugr spirit grew and came to the ears of a mighty man named Grettir. Grettir was something of an unusual man. The descendant of great warriors, he had taken it upon himself to follow the same path, fighting men and monsters of myth. They say he had great strength, and he carried an enchanted sword that brought good luck. Whether or not that's true I cannot say, but one thing I know for certain. Grettir was Thorhall and his town's very last hope. He arrived during Yuletide, in the height of winter, and for several days he stalked the town, seeking out Glamour's revenant spirit, but no sign of him could be seen. Eventually Grettir decided the whole thing was a waste of time and he made to leave, but at that moment he heard a horrendous shriek from the stables. Sprinting over, he found that his horse lay still upon the ground, his back broken. Now I do not need to tell you, my lords and knights, of the connection between a warrior and his faithful steed, and Grettir's blood began to boil. "Draugr!" he cried. "Come face me, coward!" And Glamour appeared. He was a vast grey figure, as tall as a house, and as soon as he saw him, Grettir threw himself towards the figure. All day they fought, late into the evening and deep into darkness. Eventually, Grettir gained the upper hand and leapt atop Glamour, his sword to the ghost's throat. Readying his final strike, he met the spirit's eyes, and that was his mistake. Those eyes, those black, soulless eyes that drank in all light, was the most frightening thing Grettir had ever seen. He thrust his sword forward, destroying the Draugr, driving him from the land. But those eyes... From that day forth, Grettir's days of heroism were over, and forevermore he could not walk alone in the darkness for fear of those eyes.
The bishop's tale drew to a close, but in the hall of Camelot all the guests were still wrapped and under its spell. No one moved, no one shifted. The only sound was the crackling of fire and the occasional gust of winds from outside.
"Ah," said the bishop, "it seems my tale was somewhat less joyful than the ones before, eh? Come, Sir Owain, what was the tale you told earlier about the ill-tempered goat?"
He laughed apologetically, and with that the spell of his silence was suddenly broken. "My good bishop," said Arthur, standing, "stories like that are why you were appointed my guest of honour tonight." And turning to the crowd, he said, "I declare that Bishop Badawin is the winner of my contest." A great cheer went up, for none could disagree that this was a tale well told, and Arthur smiled warmly. "Bring forth the feast, and make sure that the bishop here gets the finest cuts of all the meat. And do not worry, my lords and ladies, I am certain that ghostly apparitions and mysterious figures shall not be brave enough to bother us on this Christmas night." The crowd laughed, and Gawain was just about to join them, when a deep voice called out across the hall, its sound echoing off the walls and the vaulted ceiling. "Oh, really?" it asked. "Shall they not?" Thank you for listening. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a Settle Stories commission. Written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Story consultant was Miriam Sarin. Music was Tectonic by Saedra, downloaded via Uppbeat. It was a Parable Arts production.